to our theory of knowledge presentation. So today we will be evaluating our real-life situation, the movie Schindler's List, from which we have extracted a second-order question, a knowledge question. We will attempt to answer this through subsidiary knowledge questions within the field of history, art, and communicating history, which we will then reconnect to our knowledge question, which will be applied to, from which we will extract conclusions, which will be applied to other real-life situations.
So the real-life situation that we've decided to look at is the movie Schindler's List, which was released in 1994. It was co-produced and directed by Steven Spielberg, an American film director, and it is about this man named Oskar Schindler, who ended up saving over 1,000 Jews' lives during the Holocaust from Krakow, Poland, by employing them in his factory, and he eventually actually buys them and moves them away from Poland to save them from being sent to Auschwitz when their concentration camp closes. It's based on real events, and the movie was made from a book called Schindler's Ark, which was written a couple of years before. We chose this because we had gone on a cast trip recently to Krakow, Poland, where we were able to experience a lot of the concentration camp where they were, as well as hear a lot about the time period, and that sort of sparked our interest for this. So based on our real life situation, we have made a knowledge question, and our knowledge question is, to what extent can history be communicated through art? And to look at that, we need to look at the area of knowledge of history and how we know history. And before we can talk about how we know history, we need to answer the question, what is history? So one might easily say history is the study of the past, which it is to a certain extent, but it's actually a study of the present traces of the past. So what we have available from the past to look at, which means that history, when we study it, and historians study it, it becomes a selection of a selection, where they have to select what they find important from the primary sources that they have available, which is already only a small portion of what was ever created. When you're studying history, you need to be aware of where your sources come from. There are primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are speeches and documents from the time period, where secondary sources are historians' analysis of primary sources. And one needs to be aware of the limitations of both of these types of sources when analyzing. So because sources are so important, we need to be aware of the sources that come in play, especially for our real life situation. And since it was based on real events, where they got their information was from interviews of Schindler's Jews who had survived and who had been saved by Schindler and their experiences. And because it's based on their memories and their telling of the story, we need to be aware of sort of the limitations of that form of knowledge, which is eyewitnesses are not very reliable. Over 80% of eyewitnesses are dismissed from court cases because of a lot of these things that I'm going to mention now. So there are both deliberate and non-deliberate flaws in the way that they tell their story. Often there's the problem of sort of misremembering or forgetting events that happened because our minds are not perfect, as well as that it happened a long time ago. There's also a thing called flashbulb memories, which means that if something traumatic happened, it often stands out in their memory a lot more than other events, which sort of can blow it out of proportion from things that, like what it might actually have been. There's also more deliberate manipulations, which is sort of the narrative bias, which is when you tell a story from your memory, you want it to fit this sort of narrative and flow of storylines that becomes entertaining and interesting, and the more you tell the story that way, the more you believe that it happened in that way. There's also egocentric bias, where you want to place yourself in the center of your memories, and you think that everything revolves around you in a way. You might also tell the story in a way that depicts you more positively, as more of a hero and less weak, perhaps. And especially for our case, emotional bias comes into play because it was such an emotional time period, and since the story is told by the Jews, the way that they see Oskar Schindler is probably as this savior because he saved their lives, and they might sort of forget or disregard some of his less appealing traits.
Now, we also have to keep in mind how accurate history and its depiction is, as history is portrayed on how we view things. and from the perspective which the primary source has. Now, in this way, bias affects the accuracy of the history which is depicted. In the illustration, we see two different perspectives of the same story. And depending on the perspective of these persons, the outcome of the story that's told can be different. And here bias plays an important role. For example, confirmation bias, which is when information is chosen because it backs up a story, and information is deselected or neglected because it acts as counter-arguments to a story. For example, in our real-life situation, if the producer of a movie has made a certain persona for the main character, he might try to search for information that backs up this persona and neglect information that does not back up this persona, and therefore create a less multifaceted persona. Natural bias also plays a role because natural bias comes from the prejudices of one's nationality. For example, national pride and love to one's nation. For example, if we look at the Congolese and Rwandan conflict a few years back, where Rwanda invaded Congo, both, if you're Congolese, you will blame the Rwandans for invading, and if you're the Rwandans, they will say that the Congolese nation invited them or had the need for them to be invaded so that they could help them. Now, history can never be described objectively as it depends on the perspective, as history is a selection of a selection that's dependent on the perspective which we have. And even though we may have primary sources, we have to keep in mind that they in themselves are not always accurate because they have this bias in the way that they look at things. Another bias is hindsight bias, and when we look back in history, we may be able to see a logical flow of a story and determine how individual events have their own significance. And after you've experienced something, there may be an obvious change of action. However, there's a flaw in this, and people often choose to be opportunist after something has happened, either that they knew an outcome was a certain way, or that they want to be on the side of the winners. For example, after a war, even though a nation may have been against the nation that ended up winning after a war, they will sometimes, after the war, choose to be on the side of the winners. We have to keep in mind the perspective that comes with telling a story and its depiction, and the lens in which people look at history. The great person theory is a theory that states that history is driven by individuals that are in some way great, and without them, the course of history would be different. Now, in himself, Schindler is not a great person without the movie, but the movie is a tool in depicting Schindler as a great person, as it emphasizes characteristics such as empathy and makes him great. Schindler is seen as a hero throughout the world, not because he saved a lot of people compared to the magnitude of the people that were killed, but because he did something that no one else did, because he did something extraordinary. And he stepped out of the way of what was expected of him. Without the movie and without Schindler, history would be different, because without the movie, there would be a lot less tourist attraction to the city of Krakow, where the movie took place. And because the event took place and the movie was created of it, the places where the event took place become of significance, and people want to experience it out of interest. Now, if we look at history and the perspective that comes over time, and looking back at history, George Orwell states that who controls the past controls the future. No, who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. Now, and this means that the result of history also depends on our current perspective. For example, if Nazi Germany had won the war, our social and ideological construct would be different, and Orwell argues that if Nazi Germany had control of the media, books, and propaganda, they could write their version of history, a different version of history, and that they would be able to, and what we would read in books would be considered truth, even though it may not be, or at least it would be a different truth. But I also think that history depends on perspective, and that because we have our ideological construct, Schindler is seen as a hero, he's seen as a great person who's filled with empathy. But in a Nazi German perspective, he would be seen as a traitor and someone who went against the orders that he had and who saved people who were meant, according to Nazi German perspective, who were meant to die. And this is why it's important to keep perspective in mind when we view the accuracy of history and how it's communicated.
So now that we've discussed history, we will be going into art. We will be assessing it on a conceptual level and applying it to our real-life situation. This is critical because we need to establish that our real-life situation is an example of art for us to answer our knowledge question. So there are 3 possible criteria for art. These are denominated possible because they are in no way all-encompassing and because they are highly disputed. The first one is the intention of the artist. This criterion suggests that for art to be art, it must be created intentionally to please or provoke an audience. Therefore, it must not arise solely out of random activity and must not solely serve practical purposes. This can be disputed specifically in relation to our real-life situation, because our real-life situation is an example of commercial art. Therefore, the producers of the movie had both the dual agenda of promoting the story whilst generating profit. However, one could counterclaim this by stating that because the release of this movie greatly benefited the local community of Krakow, it was not a business incentivized project. The second criterion is the quality of the work. This criterion suggests that for art to be art, it must contain a certain extent of technical mastery. However, this criterion is also contested because while some artists, such as Han van Meegeren, a Dutch artist who was known for his prestige in making replicas of other artists' work. However, his work lacked originality. We could also argue this is the case with our real-life situation because the movie simply reproduces previously used cinematographic techniques and simply channels a story that had already appeared in novel format. However, we can also argue that certain choices created by the producers and certain combinations of choices were original and therefore to a certain extent has originality. The third criterion is the response of the spectators. This criterion suggests that for art to be art, it must incite some sort of response in viewers. In the case of our real-life situation, it incites emotions in the viewers, for example, through the presence of character development. As you can see here, the real-life situation aligns to different extents according to different criteria for art. Art plays a key role in knowing. Art has been viewed as having a very strong imitative role. Essentially, people believe that art serves the purpose of replicating reality. However, while some believe that art serves the purpose of very accurately duplicating reality, they believe in the mimetic theory of art, others believe that it serves the purpose of providing a very creative interpretation of reality. Art has also been seen as having the role for catharsis. This can be both for the artist, the spectator, or both. It depends on their relation to the emotions evoked in the piece. Art has also been viewed as having a strong educative role and communicative role because some people believe that art has the moral duty to convey certain messages.
So now that we've talked about what art is and what history is, we're going to talk about how you can communicate history effectively and some different ways of doing that. So the first one, we're going to bring together what art is and what history is and communicate history through art. So our real life situation is a really great example of communicating historical events through an art form of film and cinema. One of the strong suits of using art to communicate history is that it often has an emotional and personal aspect to its communication, which means that the reader can easily connect to the characters and understand the events in a more personal level, which is our real life situation is a good example of this because there are a lot of emotions that the viewer feels for the Jews who are going through this awful experience, and you can get this personal connection to them when they die that you then feel sad, which is a lot stronger of a feeling and experience of the historical events than reading it in a textbook, for example. One of the issues with this, though, is that because it's an art form and it has to sort of evoke this reaction from you, they sometimes lose some of the historical accuracy in sort of creating these emotions. They might add a love interest or add certain character traits that make you like this character more than he might have been in reality. Because there's always this role of fiction in art, or often is. Another issue is that art often has to be entertaining, for better or worse. For example, in Schindler's List, the way that the film is produced has this very clear storyline, and it has this good versus evil, which is entertaining and easy to follow for the viewer. But it tells this very single story. It gives only one view of the events, where Schindler is the hero and the Nazis are the villains, and it doesn't tell any other perspective of the story. Whenever you watch something in the cinema or any art form, you need to be aware of the vested interests, especially in the single story that Schindler's List is told. Because it's an American film and because the Nazis lost the war, it has a certain interest in depicting them as evil. And there might also be, because the director, Steven Spielberg, is Jewish, he might have a personal interest in telling the story the way that he did. A good thing about art is that it reaches this broader audience. Because it's less technical and has less terminology, it's able to depict these historical events in a way that anyone can see and view and enjoy. But it does remove certain complexities and depth and perspectives to the historical events. Another way of communicating art is through textbooks. Another way of communicating history is through textbooks. We've all learned about the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, and when you read about history through a textbook, it's based a lot more on facts and chronology and the rise and fall of power instead of the emotional connection to personal people in history. It often gives a little bit more of an objective view of the historical events, but of course there are still many historical biases that still apply to this. And depending on which textbook and which historian you're reading, you need to be aware of these. The good thing is that it does often give several perspectives. They tell the story and analyses from different historians. And it gives no emotion, so there's nothing to sort of blind the viewer in understanding the history or the events that happened. Another issue with the textbook, though, is that it's less accessible or understandable for the average person because it has this terminology and this academic cloud it's in. It sort of becomes less accessible for the average person.
A third way of communicating history is through museums. And here it's similar to art, where it deals with emotions. And it's similar to textbook, where it deals with facts. What's special about museums is that they try to depict an interactive experience that envelops emotions and apathy. And museums have artifacts on display. In books or in drawings, you may see images, but being in a museum, you see these artifacts in real life, and you can relate to them, and you can somehow feel their emotional effect. For example, when we went to Krakow on our cash trip, we had of course heard about history, and learned about the thousands of people that had died in Auschwitz. But visiting the museum was a very surreal experience. And what you come into is a recreation of exactly how it was a few years ago. The photo on the right shows shoes from hundreds of individuals from Auschwitz, and the stack was ginormous. Seeing it in real life made me realize the magnitude of the suffering and the horror that had happened, and that each of these shoes had belonged to a person who had gone a terrible time and who's now dead. And this was only a fraction of the thousands and thousands that were killed in Auschwitz, which gives you something very tangible to relate to. The fact that these shoes were torn out, they were worn out, they were filthy, and they were in poor condition, gives you an understanding of how horrific things must be. And linking to emotions, Sarah Topman says that if you need, Sarah Topman, the American philosopher and author, says that if you need to convince someone, you need to use empathy and emotions whilst portraying it. That means that to capture someone's understanding, you need to come up with something like a love story or a story of sacrifice to make something vivid and help the audience feel the impact of the historical events and how it has affected people. She essentially says that we can't communicate anything convincingly without the use of emotions. And without the use of emotions, we can't relate to something. The movie Schindler's List does this as well, where you follow the story of the Holocaust and how the Jewish population was rationing food a child had to jump down a sewer in order to escape being caught by the Nazis. And the emotion of disgust paints a vivid picture that brings you in contact with the emotions that you would never want to experience, and that the sacrifice was so horrific that you can somehow feel how terrible the people had at the time. The movie brings out emotions to help us understand. On the other side, the movie also has some Hollywood aspects to help be attractive and for the viewers to not be appalled.
So now we will be evaluating something that we have coined sensationalism and cinematographic limitations. Essentially, we are assessing whether or not the formal features of this art format detract from its communication of knowledge, in this case, its communication of history. So firstly, the movie follows what's called the basic movie paradigm. Essentially, this consists of a setup, confrontation, and resolution. This is reflected in the movie as we see a very happy and optimistic ending, which does not accurately represent the situation of the Jews at that time. It is merely meant to please the viewer. We can also see that sensationalism and dramatization plays a key role because if we compare the real versus the filmatized Schindler, we can see that the filmatized and dramatized Schindler possesses more grandiose features than the real Schindler himself. While one might argue that these are minimal things and that they purely serve to draw the attention of the viewer while drawing attention to the most critical aspects of the messages communicated, others could also argue that it detracts from the communication of history. Also because this characterization of Schindler adds to these love interests, which also detract from the overall historical representation. So now we will be drawing several conclusions. First, we will do this on a concrete level in relation to our real-life situation, and then we will do it on a more generalized plane. On the left-hand side, you can see statements that support the idea that history can be communicated through art to a significant extent. On the opposite side, you can see statements that support the idea that history cannot be communicated through art to a significant extent. So, according to some artistic criteria, the real-life situation is art, and art inspires emotion, a key medium through which one can communicate history. However, according to other artistic criteria, the real-life situation is not art, and cinematographic elements detract from the representation of the Holocaust. Therefore, the Holocaust would be best understood if assessed through a variety of media. Then on a generalized level, while art enhances our understanding of the depth of the human experience, it does not enhance our understanding of the breadth of the human experience, something that could be achieved through more informative media. But while art inspires emotion, a key medium through which history can be communicated, formal features of art can detract from its communication of history. Therefore, history overall can be best assessed if done through a variety of media.
Now, to relate our knowledge question does not only relate to Schindler's List, it relates to so many other things. For example, the HBO series Chernobyl. Now, this series is an attempt to depict and recreate what happened in Russia when a nuclear power plant melted down. Now, it attempts to describe what happens, but national bias is a very strong example here, as Russia is making their own version and depiction of the film, which emphasizes that it was actually American spies who caused the catastrophe. This is an example of national bias because Russian national pride cannot accept that Russia is incompetent, has a lack of knowledge, or that other bad sides of Russia caused or led to the catastrophe of the meltdown. And they have planned to make a story that fits their view and their view of the story and their view of the world. Even though HBO may have tried to create a realistic depiction of what happened, from the perspective of the Russians, this was wrong, and they choose to or want to see something else.
Another form of real-life situation that our question can apply to are historical fiction books, which are books such as like The Book Thief, which are based and set in a historical time period, but involve characters that are completely fictional and sometimes often fantastical elements as well. For example, in The Book Thief, it's narrated by death, it can't happen in real life, but it is about this young girl who grows up during World War II in Germany, and it talks about her experiences, and it does tell a lot of things that did happen during the time, including the public's fear of bombing, the Hitler youth camps, and the general poverty and fear that was spread across the people of Germany during the time period. So although historical fiction books don't tell the story of real people, they do show a historical time period, and that in a way that a reader can easily understand, and through an entertaining medium where they don't attempt to tell a true story.
Another example of a real-life situation is documentaries. Here we can see An Inconvenient Truth. This was a documentary which outraged the public because it revealed the inconvenient truth of climate change. Essentially, we can use this real-life situation to support our statements or our conclusions previously made on our understanding of the breadth and depth of the human experience. Essentially, because this is in a documentary format, it provides a more broad view of the situation. Therefore, because of the informative element of a documentary, it allows for us to have a better understanding of the breadth of the human experience, whereas had it been filmatized and followed a very specific scenario, then it would have given us insight to the depth of the human experience. We have two other examples, and what they have in common is that they both are able to utilize emotion to communicate knowledge. Our first one is We Live in Cairo. It is a musical that was used to depict the Arab Springs uprising, and essentially the creators of it actually consulted historians to ensure that this is historically accurate. Our second example is a work of fiction called The Capital, and essentially throughout the depiction of very emotionally laden relations and characters and development, they're able to actually represent something that they're able to represent the bureaucracy of the EU. So even these kinds of political things can be represented through emotions. So what these have in common is that they both use emotions as an instrument to communicate knowledge.